from a working class family and growing up in a very bleak 1960s northeast Manchester, yet completely happy and unaware of the hardships and troubles of my parents and the people in the area must have faced in those days, just putting food on the table. And of course being part of a community that lived under the shadow of the likes of Ian Brady and Mara Hindley. As a teenager coming into the late 70s, I'm ready for something different. A completely new world opened to me in the form of the Ranch Bar, which was originally a gay bar with very tacky Wild West decor, owned by local drag artist Fufu Lamar. It attracted quite a strange mix of people, all drawn by the sounds of Roxy Music, Bowie and Lou Reed, and then later a transition with the influx of punk records being played. It was a place where upon leaving at the end of the night, you had to run a kind of gauntlet of teddy boys waiting just outside the doors, kicking and throwing punches at your head. This is where I first met Pete Shelley and was introduced to the Buzzcocks and the people around them, such as Richard Boone, their manager. I then started travelling around with the Buzzcocks as part of their crew, and it was at this point that the Tiller Boys was formed, our first gig being with Joy Division, and it appears on the iconic factory poster which was designed by Pete Saville. The Tiller Boys was a duo mainly, formed by drummer Francis Cookson and myself, and occasionally Pete Shelley, who recorded the single Big Noise from the Jungle with us. This was a kind of amphetamine-fueled, noise-like homage to Sandy Nelson. The other occasional Tiller Boy member was Magazine's Barry Adamson, with whom we did a few gigs, including The Final Solution. As the Tiller Boys were somewhat taken under the wing of Tony Wilson, I get asked the question why we didn't release on Factory. And to be completely honest, it was Shelley's idea to go with New Hormones, which I was totally happy with, and really at the time, I was more interested in the creative side of things to pay too much attention. With hindsight, maybe I suffered a little from the naivety of youth. A few of us around Manchester, such as Lindsay Reed and Richard Boone, for example, got together to start the Beach Club. It was located in a tiny two-storey drinking hole in the city centre back streets, where on the first floor, films were shown. Anything from Louis Buñuel to the 60s B-movies that Richard really liked. The second floor was for live music, where we put many bands on and also used it as a place to do improvised performance between members of a certain ratio, together with other musicians and myself. All of this was much to the dismay of the old bar staff that came with the club.
I was friends with Eric Randon, Francis and Pete Shelley, aka the Tiller Boys, in the 70s and the early days of the Russell Factory Club. And subsequently, out of that and their connection with New Hormones, the Beach Club was born. I think the Tillers and I were probably breaking away from the factory ethos somewhat at the time. The idea of the Beach Club was to do something a bit more avant-garde and creative than merely just putting bands on the stage. The building itself was different. It was on 2 or 3 stories with a steep staircase on entry, perfect for having a floor for film and one for music. It was rather a seedy dump, but that suited the ambience somehow. Eric was really enthusiastic about the film side of it. I think that was his baby, as I recall. The films were quite way out and surrealistic, He also put together different combinations of various band members, which was interesting. I seem to recall rather arty film backdrops as well. The whole thing was a good collaborative effort between all the contributors. The Freshies played on surfboards to get in the mood for the beach. It wasn't particularly serious, it wasn't meant to be, but it worked for the time that we did it.
The Tiller Boys were rather short-lived due to their reactionary concept against rock and roll egos and band relationships, which sadly, in our experience, some of the punk and new wave bands had done little to distance themselves from. This brought about the Free Agents concept, an album of two halves. One side was recordings made at Graveyard Studios that included input from Ian, a singer and guitarist from a band called The Worst. The other side was a recording of the Tiller Boys gig, made at York University when we supported Gang of Four. This was mastered backwards for the album. Next, I decided to record my first solo work and enlisted the help of Cabaret Voltaire, who I'd become great friends with after meeting them when they supported the Buzzcocks and formed an instant respect that has lasted till the present day.
I first encountered Eric's music via a love of Cabaret Voltaire's work. Their paths seemed to intertwine throughout the early to mid-1980s. A shared production here, guesting on each other's recordings, Eric standing in for live outings after Chris left the Cabs, and touring with the Cabs across the UK in 1982. That led me to collect his music too. It complements, rather than replicates, what the Cabs were doing.
And so the beginning of Eric Random, and That's What I Like About Me, was recorded at Western Works, which was Cabaret Voltaire's studio, and produced by Stephen Mallender and Richard Kirk. Included on this was Call Me, a live recording from the Lyceum in London, which was one of the more memorable of my British gigs.
We recorded That's What I Like About Me at Western Works. It was probably one of the really early recordings we did with other artists, I think. We mainly worked for ourselves and done a few Sheffield bands, so it's one of the first external ones, I think. How did it come about? Well, Eric and I have been friends for a couple of years. We'd met when the Cabs were playing at the Lyceum with the Buzzcocks and the Slits, I think, and John Cooper Clarke, and Eric was part of the Buzzcocks setup, and we became really good mates, and that was it. It was just, it came out, drawn out of a friendship, and Eric used to come over to Sheffield and hang out. I used to go over to Manchester and hang out, and we'd sort of we make music and jam and do stuff, and we obviously had a studio, and Eric had ideas, and also with Richard Boone wanting to bring it out on New Hormones, there was an opportunity to do something, and it was simple as that. It was quite easy. It wasn't long and convoluted. Things were easy in those days. You wanted to do something, you worked with friends, you did it, simple as that. So that's why it came out. I can't really remember how much I had to do with this, casting my mind back quite a long way, but I do love the record. I remember the sleeve was amazing. I thought it was a really cool sleeve. I can't remember who did it. Maybe it was Linda from Ludus, because she was doing stuff for New Hormones and friends of the guys in Manchester at that time, so I think it came from that. And the live version of Call Me was on it, because I think it was just a track that worked well live, and that was the state of things in those days. Live recordings were a good way. If you got good recordings, they were a good way of capturing the feel and the spirit and the sound of what you were doing, just as much as you did in the studio. So Eric, a little bit like ourselves, we used to record all our gigs where possible, and just to hear them really, and then if something worked out well, then you'd go, well, let everybody else hear it, and that's how that happened.
I remember this record being very well received and made NME Record of the Week. I then began working with one or two new musicians, one of which was Graham Didds, a drummer who I'd poached from label mates Ludus. This was the beginning of the first incarnation of the Bedlamites and a series of singles and albums. For example, Mad as Mankind, released on Double Vision, an early forerunner to the electronic dance music that was to create so much interest in later years. Also 23 Skidoo for Le Disque du Crépuscule, a wall of sound montage that included sounds from a cassette I found on the street.
I first met Eric in some point in 1980 when I joined a band called Ludus, another Manchester band who were signed to New Hormones. I came up from London to Manchester to start working with them. Eric was also signed to New Hormones, and over the next few months I got to know Eric reasonably well as we played lots of joint bills together, really. And I hit it off with Eric as a human being, and became mates, and I also really admired his music. At that time he was doing the treated guitar with a drum machine and starting to work a bit with Lynn Walton. It's true to say there was some tension between Ludus and Eric, mostly resentment from Ludus's side towards Eric rather than the other way around, I think it has to be said. And I felt a bit caught in the middle because I got on really well with Eric, but obviously I was a member of Ludus really and enjoyed being in Ludus. However, at some point late 1981 I was sacked from Ludus, and around the same point I got a call from Eric asking if I would join an extended band he was putting together under the name of Bedlamites, initially to do a version of Ravel's Bolero.
Earthbound Ghostneed, another Cabaret Voltaire collaboration, with Mal and Richard actually playing on the tracks as well as producing the sessions.
And we did Bolero, that was Eric's thing. I think it was just one of those things. Bolero is an amazing piece of music, incredibly long, builds. It's sort of like Sister Ray, you know, but a compositional piece. It's something that builds and builds and builds, and so it really suited the type of music that Eric was making, and I played, from my memory, and having listened to it not that long ago, quite annoying slap bass on it. Why I did that must have been the thing at the time, that I was playing sort of that kind of bass, but I hope I didn't completely ruin it. But it's a great version. I think Andy Diagram does the horns on it, and I think Richard's in there somewhere. I'm not quite sure where, but it was very much a fun thing and we really enjoyed it. But Bolero it captured that kind of repetitive groove that was going on, but also quite minimalist as well, and the horns always sound great. So that was why that happened, I think. I don't know how it did. Was it ahead of its time? No, not really, when Ravel wrote it in 19 whenever. So I think we were just catching up with where Ravel was at, so we were a little bit behind, not ahead of our time.
Around this time, a number of my contemporaries were venturing into changes in their music, I think under pressure from record companies or just imitating their more commercial influences, something I was not tempted to do. Not because I thought it beneath me artistically, but in doing so, I thought it limits what you did from then on. I think my not having a consistent sound has always been a drawback for me as a product.
Eric has, for me, always been a man in the shadows. Clearly not a self-publicist, he leaves the music to do the talking, and it does, in abundance, to those who are listening.
I can't really comment on commerciality in music. Eric's, mine, or anyone's. You make music, you don't make it to make money. You make music because it's what you want to do. And Eric has always made the things he wanted to do regardless of what people thought. I think quite admirably, he doesn't seek an audience, he doesn't seek a particular kind of group of people, he just makes music. And you know, in the old idiom, if you make good stuff, people will beat a path to your door. And Eric's always a believer in just making the music he wants, and people will relate to it if they see fit, and if they don't, then that's missing out.
As time went on, it was obvious that Eric was being more and more influenced by musics from other parts of the world, really. We were both big dub reggae fans, and that was always an influence. But in particular, Indian music became a big thing for Eric. He took up the tabla, and I suppose over the next couple of albums, the music became more, I don't like to use the word world music, but certainly influenced by musics from different parts of the world, and with some of the other musicians who joined, also a little bit jazzier. And I think Eric alludes to the fact that people perceive that as less commercial, really, I suppose, and maybe there's some truth in that. I think people who had seen Eric as a part of the kind of industrial electronic music world, with his association with the Cabs and others, weren't able really to take the development of direction as they should have done, really. So I think that became a little bit of a difficult area in a commercial sense, though certainly not in a creative sense. I also had a conversation with Eric and Alan Wise about putting together a band or joining a band to back Nico, who decided to live in Manchester at that point. So over the next little bit of time, there became in a way two separate projects that I worked with Eric, both under the name of Bedlamites, one backing Nico and one as a distinct artistic entity as Eric Random and the Bedlamites.
Then Nico came to town. Sitting in the dressing room at Rafters Club in Manchester, waiting to go on as her support, Nico walks in and sits next to me and asked me if I would accompany her on one or two songs. I said I would be happy to, not realising that this was the beginning of a working friendship that would last for over 7 years. Playing with Nico in both the Faction and the Bedlamites, constantly touring and non-stop moving, probably the highlight being the Behind the Iron Curtain tour, when we played in Poland and Hungary, and to my experience, the most severely affected by the Soviet regime of all the Eastern Bloc countries, Czechoslovakia, where we had to sneak across the border as tourists. Not only were we there illegally, but the music we played was actually classed as illegal, which led to such bizarre situations as the meeting in the middle of the night in a forest, to be paid in the currency of diesel for the gig that we had played earlier that evening. It could have been my paranoia, but I was also convinced we were constantly followed by a beautiful vintage black Tatra sedan throughout the whole trip. The finale to all this was a gig in Prague, whereas we came off stage expecting a meal and a few drinks, only to be greeted by the secret police, holding the promoter by his throat and banging his head against the wall. Then we were quickly herded outside and put on our bus and headed for the border. In the summer of '88, I had been asked to play a concert in the Grizia Castle in northern Italy, and Nico had decided to have a short holiday in Ibiza. I was woken in my hotel room the morning after the concert by a phone call telling me that she was gone. Her funeral took place a short while later on a sad but very beautiful day in a very pretty forest in Berlin.
And you mentioned Pressure Company. Eric did play on Pressure Company album. It was a live album. Again, it was just part of the spirit of the time. We were around. We were asked to do a gig to raise money for Solidarity, which was the Polish mine workers union. And Richard himself, as the Cabs, were a little bit sort of it sat a bit uncomfortably doing sort of benefit gigs. We didn't like the way, particularly around that time, and continually people used their name, attached them to causes, and we didn't. It's not that we didn't agree with the causes, but we didn't want to be seen for the cause to sort of be used with our name and us to sort of gain from it. So we've always distanced ourselves from those kinds of things, and hence we did it under the pseudonym of the Pressure Company. And Eric was around at the time, and it was just a one-off. So we got Nort, the drummer, from Sheffield, and myself playing bass, and Eric playing additional guitar, and it was loads of fun doing it. And it was just a one-off live gig at Sheffield University that then, as a live recording, gained money for Solidarity. And again, it was just we were there at that time. Eric was around. It's like, Eric, do you fancy playing on this, doing this gig? We was like, yeah, whatever. So yeah, that's how it.
Now I decided to break for a while, as the lifestyle of constantly touring had left me more than a little weary, and I had disbanded the Bedlamites as I thought musically we had reached a peak.
I guess my position in the Bedlamites, I remained in the band for the long term, but because I was living in London and the band were based in Manchester, I was less a part of the conceiving of new material through jamming and stuff, and more coming in to add my parts, I guess, at a slightly later stage. But I remained a part, and a very happy part of being the Bedlamites all the way through the period, really.
Another live collaboration was with Psychic TV at what, if I remember correctly, was the Paradiso in Amsterdam. It was a very intense performance of distortion and feedback, and anyone who's seen Genesis P-Orridge perform will know that his actions on stage could be fairly extreme. I remember the performance. You could feel the tension building, the aggression, as Genesis, whipping himself into a frenzy, produces these stage lighting bulbs. Really beautiful things, huge glass spheres that he proceeded to smash and crush into his body, throwing fistfuls of powdered broken glass all over the stage and right into my face. Incredibly, I finished the performance without a scratch on me. I began playing live again in 1990 with Seema, the vocalist who was brought in for the last ever Bedlamites gig I'd just mentioned. She had trained in classical Indian vocals since being a young girl, and together we toured with Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan and also with Salif Keita. I then brought in two more vocalists, Jamaican-born Country Culture and the son of Ghanaian tribal chief and master drummer Kwasi Asante, plus other musicians such as sax players, percussionists and guitar. The name Free Agents was brought out of the box again, and we began to perform at events like Whoa Madam Whirligig. Also at this time, the venues we were playing were becoming more and more rave-like in atmosphere, which I started to feel a little uncomfortable with. For one thing, venue technicians were usually quite taken aback when a 7-piece band turns up, as this had become the age of the PA, which basically meant miming. Plus the onslaught of ecstasy, which did a lot, in my mind, to damage people's taste and musical integrity, limiting everything into just pure escapism. Finally, growing more and more distant from what was happening, not just artistically but culturally, with the Americanization of the world in full force, my performing live and recording came to a halt in 2000 after playing what was to become a farewell gig when Richard H. Kirk asked Seema and myself to accompany him at the Millennium Festival in Nantes. My next move was to begin writing music for a production company who had commissioned me to write for various documentaries and TV projects, including 2 series of an international children's programme. This was very liberating for me as it opened up areas I had not worked in before. Although I insisted that I would only write credible pieces of music and not be treated as a sound library or a way of copying someone else's style without paying out large fees, which is quite common. And this worked quite well for a few years until a new set of directors moved in and the working atmosphere changed completely. So in the end, I just walked away from this. Luckily, around the same time, I acquired a house in a little town called Essaouira in Morocco, and settling in there, and along with my trips into the Sahara, kept me occupied and revived from the doldrums of England. A phone call out of the blue from Walter Robotka, someone who I had a contact with in the past. He runs a label out of Vienna, and he wanted me to take part in an event he was putting on with Wrangler, Steve Mallander's new project. Taking part triggered a new sense of excitement, and I am now writing in a style that is more akin to my electronic roots, bringing about a series of gigs in Europe and 2 new albums. First to be released was Mandog, which contained Knock Yourself Out, an African electro chant. And my latest release, Words Made Flesh, which has said goodbye to ethnic influences and taken on more of a song format, with tracks like In Blood and In Flesh.
That's really something. Out of nowhere. That's really something. Out of nowhere. That's really something. Uncorruptible, information, unconditional, infatuation.
The access to digital technology has also had some negative effects, especially on the experimental avant-garde noise genre, leaving it all rather contained and soulless. Despite this, I shall continue making music, as really I have no choice in the matter, just as an addict has no say in his habits.
That's really something.
In the future, I hope to live a productive and happy life, watching my children, Roma and Roop, grow up as free-thinking individuals in a world that is at least a little more secure and open than it has been in recent years.
Eric has continued in the experimental genre, making great music with the Free Agents amongst others. Doubtless, like many musicians in Manchester and others, he hasn't had the recognition he deserves.
Eric's recent return to active music making spurred me on to create a Facebook group to discuss and share his music. I was happy to finally see him play live with the late Stuart James at Manchester's Band on the Wall in 2014, and again later the same year as part of the Sheffield supergroup Ibison at the No Lectures at Western Works event. So Eric, thank you for the music.
Complete. Sublime. Deceit. So perfect. So mean. This world.
As for Eric as a person, well, Eric's one of the warmest, friendliest, easiest people to get on with. As a musical friend, what's fantastic about Eric is he's not at all dictatorial. He was very open to people bringing their own individuality and their own specific approaches to stuff, which made him very easy to work with. To be honest, very unlike working in Ludus. And as a human being, well, for me it's summed up by a small anecdote. On my 60th birthday, a dear friend organised a surprise birthday party, and I was a little bit shocked and taken aback by it, not terribly comfortable with it, and then a hand tapped me on the shoulder, turned round, and it was Eric. All right, Dids. And Eric had jumped on a train from Manchester to come down for a couple of hours to share in my 60th birthday before he had to jump back on the train for commitments in Manchester. And that's Eric summed up in a short anecdote, really. That kind of friend who you don't need to see. I hadn't seen him for 5 years before then, but remains one of my closest and warmest friends, really. So that's Eric for me. Been a pleasure. Hope to do some more of it. Thanks.
Eric the man. Yeah, Eric the man, that's it. What can I say? Eric's been a good friend for many years, and although I sort of lived all over and I was in Australia for quite a number of years, I've been back there for quite a while. As soon as I came back, it was great to kind of touch base with Eric, and we've done stuff together, and we, you know, as Wrangler as I'm now working, we're a massive supporter of Eric, and when he works with Dids, and he's still making great music, and of course I still go and hang out at his house, and so when he's in the studio, I'm invariably down there with him, putting my bits in and bringing in his record, as I've always done. So nothing changes, and he's a brilliant guy, and long may we continue to hang out, make music, and have fun, and I'm sure we will. Respect to the man. Eric, the Prince of Manchester.
fleshwork designed so neat, so blind to see, so perfect, so neat. Resist the urge to spit fleshwork so perfect, so neat, so blind.